Hello. Hi and welcome everyone. I'm Heather Roberge, the chair of the Department of Architecture and Urban Design. Thank you for joining us tonight. So tonight I have the pleasure of introducing Mark Foster Gage. Mark is Assistant Dean at the Yale School of Architecture, where he's taught since 2001. He's also principal of Mark Foster Gage Architects in New York City. In addition to his roles as professor and architect, Mark is an author and a tireless advocate for contemporary avant-garde architecture. As an author, Mark has written extensively on architecture and design in academic and popular outlets. His major works include Aesthetic Theory, Essential Texts for Architecture and Design, Composite Surfaces and Software, High Performance Architecture, and forthcoming Mark Foster Gage, The Software Diaries. He's a regular contributor to the journal Log, contributing as co-editor of issue 19 and most recently in conversation with Michael Meredith in issue 40. Mark has successfully introduced architectural speculation into popular media and consumer experiences and products. From award-winning retail projects and accessory design with Nicola Formichetti to engagements with Google, Diesel, Samsung, and Vice Media, he's found outlets for his work far beyond the standard professional commission. His ornamental, visually provocative confection, the Khaleesi Tower, for downtown Manhattan, was featured in both Tech and Business Insider, Vice's creator project, and numerous online sites, blogs, and Pinterest boards. With it, he taps into a popular love of fantasy while offering a critical, and I would revise this word now, assessment of an alternative to Manhattan's proliferation of the pencil tower. So, whether in the context of a stone cutting seminar at Yale or a high production value rendering package, Mark's work celebrates architecture's power to seduce, captivate, provoke, and transform. Please join me in welcoming Mark.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. It's always super great to be here at UCLA. It's weird, like some places it's really easy to lecture and some places it's really hard to lecture. And this is a really hard place to lecture because I know so many of the faculty. And I taught, I think, 6 studios with Greg at Yale, about 6. So any good ideas I have in this lecture are just like 10-year-old Greg ideas. Any bad ideas are either entirely my own or I heard them from Jason Payne. What I want to talk about today is, I mean, as Heather mentioned, I've been teaching at Yale for now, I guess, 17 years. And I've noticed that architectural lectures have become kind of less and less interesting because you can just see people's work online, which didn't always used to be the case. So I think it's more interesting now to talk about something current rather than something that I've written about previously. So this is maybe like a kind of dry run of some material that I've been playing with in the office. And it has to do with a kind of a flattening in the world, which we all know is happening, a kind of removal of hierarchy from different disciplines. We know things like speculative realism and object-oriented ontology and philosophy are technically what you call flat ontologies. We know in the kind of circles of social justice, there's an interest in Black Lives Matter and reasserting gender equality, which again is a removal of a type of hierarchy, which has existed for a very, very, very long time. We know there's an interest in, although not successfully addressing it, but income inequality, in removing income and economic hierarchies, and you saw that get a significant kind of bump in momentum from Bernie Sanders' campaign and things like Occupy Wall Street, although the nation seems to have gone in a kind of another direction. But one of the drawbacks of that absence of hierarchy is what's happened in the media and what's happened with what I would call our conceptual framework through which we understand reality. So information used to go through a kind of process before it was disseminated. And to represent that process, I have this image here of Meryl Streep on the left. Um, this is an image from that movie, The Post, where she's the editor of the Washington Post. And in the past, the kind of trajectory of information would trickle down to a couple of key people, usually editors at major newspapers or networks, and then they would introduce what's called an ethical gap in journalism, where they would kind of assess the value of the information, the truth, quote unquote, of the information, and then turn around and broadcast it to millions of people. We know one of the after effects of not having that hierarchical system in place. Of course, with the introduction of the internet, people can get whatever information they need. People aren't anymore given information. There's no ethical gaps between people and their information, which we know has led to a kind of nefarious misuse of reality for political gain. And I don't need to rehearse all the details of that, but you know the story. So there's a couple things we can do with that. One is this is a kind of great list my friend Michael Young came up with, but how do you combat that like problems in the slippages of reality? What can humans do? What can citizens do? What can architects do? So one of the answers is satire. So this is my design for the Trump library that a publication asked me to do. So this is a plan, and you enter through the immigrant detector into the largest rally space ever. This is the Hall of Caged Nasty Women. This is the vault for Kelly and Conway's soul. A is mostly empty. This is Matt Bannon's control room. And K, L, and M, nobody knows what those are because they're owned by Vladimir Putin. But this is, all, of course, very satisfying to be satirical or to watch MSNBC and feel superior to the kind of situation. And that's certainly a response. And we could all watch The Daily Show and MSNBC and feel comfort in our superiority, but that's not really a solution, although this did help get it out of my system. But there's a couple other options of ways that architects or citizens might start to address this problem. Another is through critical theory, which is critically exposing the falsehoods, which is introducing true information into what's already a flat archive of too much information, so that information is generally lost in the same way that true information is lost. You can call out the producers as liars, so you can show that a certain politician lied in the past, and what they say in the future might also be lies, and that also seems to have had no significant impact. You can search for real data. You can pull out President Obama's birth certificate that shows he was born in Hawaii and is an American citizen and a Christian, but half of the country will still believe he's a Muslim of Kenyan descent. So the presence of the true information seems to not be able to penetrate through that obstacle of a shifted reality. You can ignore the problem altogether. You can be indifferent to it, which is a kind of ongoing discussion I have with Michael Meredith that was most recently featured in our back and forth in log. Or you can do another thing, which is happening in a couple industries, which I'm not sure will work, but it's another possibility, and that's looking at the aesthetic disruptions of the real, like causing a kind of a slippage in what you assume is your reality and how you normally take it for granted. And some good examples of that are like Black Mirror, the show Black Mirror, if you guys have seen it, typically takes a counterfactual scenario that says you have this thing in your hand already, this iPhone, and if it develops along these certain paths, this is a possible outcome. Or you look at a show like The Handmaid's Tale on Hulu, which has a scenario that says if if a political regime takes over part of the United States and women lose the rights and control of their bodies, this is kind of the outcome of that possibility. So doing a small speculation on the future that's entirely recognizable as our own world has a kind of political charge that wouldn't in the same way a kind of Star Trek scenario might. So in The Handmaid's Tale, you know this is a Mercedes. You've seen Mercedes before. It's pretty explicit about saying we are not so different. So when all women become breeding machines and lose rights, it's just taking the recognition that the United States, as I just said in a discussion with the students about an hour ago, the United States is currently one Supreme Court justice away from all women losing legal control over their uteruses. So you take that fact and extrapolate that to the rest of the bodies, and you get a kind of plot line which gives something like The Handmaid's Tale its political charge. It's happening in the arts. You're getting parafictional and counterfactual projects. In, for instance, Damien Hirst's most recent project called Treasures from the Wreck of the Unbelievable, where he does a really extensive series of sculptures, large, huge CNC marble busts, small coins, collections of items, with the premise that it was Pharaoh's treasure barge that was sunk in the Indian Ocean, and he paid to raise the barge up, and he's selling these objects on the art market. So he went to the extent of, actually submerging the sculptures he did in the ocean, and then paying divers to bring them back up so he could take photos of the salvage effort. You know, creating an entire reality in fiction that then he then disrupts by showing something like a Mickey Mouse here. So if the premise is it's a treasure barge for an Egyptian pharaoh, then it's of course impossible that there would be Mickey Mouse because Mickey Mouse is 80 years old and pharaohs existed 2,000 years ago. So he's already impregnating like a slippage in this reality that he's producing, the idea of which is picked up by art critics like Hal Foster, who's asking if techniques like these parafictional techniques, can be used to combat things like fake news. And you see his Optimus Prime here covered in coral. So Damien Hirst, it's estimated, spent $50 million of his own money producing this work, and its value on the art market has been estimated at $2 billion. And the only thing that's added to the physical objects that he's producing is this kind of artistic fiction, which I think is interesting, not because I have any answers on how to do this in architecture, but because architecture has a history of calibrating people's perceptions of reality. So if you look at the architecture of, say, Periclean Greece, this is the Parthenon on the left, you may know from history class, or I don't know if students take history anymore, but the Periclean Greek architects, when temples got to be a certain scale, they realized that they looked distorted to the human eye. So they actually distorted the temples so that they didn't look distorted. There's a recalibration of the aesthetics of temples to address the deficiency in humans' ability to understand what is real. So on the Parthenon, things like the stylobate, which is the base, are subtly curved. The corner columns are actually leaning inward slightly. The spacing is different on the quarter columns. And the whole architrave is tipped forward. So there's actually not a straight line anywhere on the Parthenon. Vitruvius, who wrote the 10 books on architecture about 400 years after the Parthenon, Roman architect, kind of goes through the specifics of how to produce classical architecture, what to do, how everything is sized, the torus, scotia, torus, plinth, volutes, triglyphs, metopes, details. It's all incredibly prescribed down to minute detail how and where these things are sized and scaled. But then he has this famous section called the chapter on the ore, which is in book 2, where he says, but this is the way you do all this stuff. But humans are also defective in their ability to see things as they truly are. And he gives the example of when you're rowing in a boat, which I'm sure you all do frequently, you stick the oar in the water and the oar appears as if it's bent or broken. And the idea that emerges from Euclid was that the eyes shoot out rays, and these rays are being screwed up by the water, which isn't entirely wrong, half right. But he says it's perfectly okay to follow all these rules, but if something doesn't look right, you distort it until it looks right, which is essentially the same thing that the Greek architects were saying, was that architecture has the responsibility to calibrate people's perception of reality. And these are some images of the Parthenon, which I'm sure you've seen, but this is an exaggeration of the stylobate, the base, which is curved. And it wasn't just the stylobate that was curved, they actually curved the foundations. I'm sure you, like faculty members who are doing projects, can imagine that discussion with a contractor. I just want you to slightly curve the foundations at a ratio of 1 to 1,000. So it looks right. But here you see that slight curvature, with the naked eye. If you look at another case study in architecture's history of manipulating reality, you might stumble upon Filippo Brunelleschi, who in 1421 conducted an experiment in front of the baptistry in front of the Duomo in Florence. And he essentially had a series of mirrors with holes in them. He was looking through, trying to figure out how perspective worked to the human eye. And he's been credited with rediscovering perspective, although what he technically rediscovered was called the horizon line isoscephaly, which is the ability to measure distance in the z dimension. So the introduction of perspective into not only architecture but human discourse did something really dramatic that changed at least this European culture from being a culture where God's perception was primary to one where humans' perception was primary. An example of that is you see this is a geometric drawing of a cylinder from the 13th century. So if you think of a cylinder, it has a circle on the top and a circle on the bottom, and it's connected. And there's no effort to make it appear real. Whereas after the introduction of perspective, this is Uccello's chalice, world's first wireframe, as far as I can tell, constructed in 1450. That there's actually not only the ability to understand how humans understand reality through perspective, but there's the ability to now predict how humans will understand reality through perspective. This is a map of Florence from the 1350s, and you can tell it's Florence by the baptistry here. There's obviously no depth, whereas a century later, this is the map and chains from 1480 is all in perspective, and you see the Duomo at the center. And it's just that introduction of perspective that not only changed our representational strategies, but also changed that viewpoint from, again, being what God saw to being what humans saw. Before perspective, before the 14th, 15th, 14th century, late 14th century, it didn't matter what humans saw or how humans saw. It only mattered how God saw things. It wouldn't have even have occurred to you if you were a 12th century architect to draw something in a way that a human would actually see it. That wouldn't have even been in your conceptual framework. Afterwards, that changed significantly. All of a sudden, the Renaissance is defined exactly by what humans see. And thus, it's called Renaissance humanism, human being the um, root of the word, which of course leads to most contemporary education, which is in the humanities, which some of you may be taking classes in the humanities now. But the other next phase, or let's say next core sample of this, is in reality. This ability for architect to address reality in different ways is Palladio, who in the mid 16th century published his Quattro Libri. Projects like his Villa Cornaro and Villa Visera and Valmarana. I believe Villa Visera is actually larger. Like he draws it in his monograph and puts the dimensions on it. But if you calculate those dimensions, the building is actually larger than the site on which it was actually constructed. Is my computer coming undone here? The building is larger than the site on which it was actually constructed. It's like the first example of architecture being fictionalized to be idealized, but masquerading as real. In Villa Cornaro, if you add up the interior dimensions, compare with its exterior dimensions, it would require the building to have negative wall thickness, which of course is another example of pure architectural fiction, showing the architecture how he wanted it to have been built, not how it actually was built. So this leaves us with our proverbial Robert Frost two roads. On one side of that road is this problem in contemporary American culture in particular that has something to do with the perception of reality. And on the other side, there's architecture that has a history with dealing of the perception of reality. And my friend David Rue has a quote that he says, architecture is the first thing that tells us what reality looks like. That our very physical fabric of how we navigate through the world, where you came into this room, where you turned left, where you went upstairs, all comes from an architect making a decision at some point in time. The question is whether we want to bother marrying up that problem of reality with architecture's history of calibrating reality, or if we just want to kind of carry along or make some money or solve clients' problems or become lead silver, or what the other architecture agendas are. So there's a lot of writing going on about this subject of reality, not just in architecture, but it is being addressed most forcefully in architecture through the discourse of aesthetics by people like Jacques Rancière, Graham Harman, Timothy Morton, and even like popular writing by, this is a great little book called The Trouble with Reality by Brooke Gladstone, who is the NPR host I'm sure half of you listen to all day long. So what I've been doing, I guess, in my office, sometimes more directly, sometimes a little more tangentially, is addressing some of these ideas. And I would say these first couple of projects, especially, were just explorations in these, let's say, philosophical ideas being taken through architecture. Um, this isn't how I think the world should look. Like, this is not like Mark Gage style. I get texts from all over the world of piles of junk saying like, "Look, Mark, someone's doing your work," which isn't the intention. This is just like an idea rendered through architecture, which hopefully you'll see leads to other ideas. And this project was for our Helsinki Guggenheim Museum, which owes, it's probably like, you might consider it the super ugly granddaughter of Greg Lynn's toy furniture, like super figural collections of pre-existing items. Also combined with this history of what's called kit bashing. The first example I could find of kit bashing was the television show Thunderbirds from the 1950s, although there might be previous ones. But basically, it's kind of a puppet show. If you guys know that movie Team America, uh, that's ripping off the aesthetic of Thunderbirds. But what they did in Thunderbirds is because they needed to produce models of vehicles that didn't exist, they would just buy different model kits and start hammering them together or gluing them together to create these weird hybrid kind of futuristic looking vehicles. So literally the model kits, like you would go buy little model kits from a plastic airplane, they would buy a ton of kits, take all the parts, rearrange them, configure them into these kind of strange hybrid objects that combine, power drills and tanks. And that strategy was used uh, up until, like, really until digital technology and became a kind of stand-in for a sci-fi aesthetic. So here's George Lucas looking at the original model of the Death Star, and you can literally see all the model kits behind him. So this could be like 100 boxes of the same Viking model ship. This could be 100 boxes of the same World War II fighter that they're pulling apart the plastic pieces and applying detail at larger and larger scales to produce the effect of something being out of this world, or not of this world at least. So our strategy was to download random objects from online and use those in this kind of kit-bashed way and do things like shave off the sides, recombine them in different ways, trying to find whether or not we wanted to use them, have them lose their symbolic content or maintain it. This was, I guess, an early experiment in that removal of hierarchy. Like, one thing that's bothered me quite a bit in architecture is how it's become a discourse of sound bites. So I live not too far from the World Trade Center site, and Santiago Calatrava did the transit center there, which is intended to be a dove being released from a child's hand, which, yeah, right. And the World Trade Center is 1,776 feet tall to reflect the year in which America signed the Declaration of Independence. Um, so my dad visited me last summer, and I'm like, "Dad, what'd you do today?" He goes, "Well, I went and saw the Dove Building and the 1776 thing," and then it was like, and then I got lunch, But it's because you could just dismiss the architecture by understanding the soundbite that describes it that I find like nauseating and detrimental to the profession, because it allows you to understand and dismiss something in a very short amount of time. So this project was essentially an attempt to try to introduce so much symbolism that it'd be impossible to withdraw or extract any particular official meaning. That in order to make something meaningless, you have to produce so much meaning that it's impossible to have a correct one. So it's essentially a pile of objects. I'm going to show a video. more, but I won't subject you. Georgina's like, thank God. I don't know. So I just love this image that the proposal was intended to be provocative, but this is Arata Isozaki presenting my work, and he wrote the word weird over the top with exclamation points. So I think that's some. I'm of the Oscar Wilde school of thought that thinks it's, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. So this is a small victory in my book. Um, as Heather mentioned, I've been doing some work with the students at Yale and trying to get this stuff out of the computer just to see what it might look like. Not because, again, they think the world needs to be like this, but this is a 3D print. You can just kind of see the high resolution detail. It's not symmetrical, although kind of symmetrical. Um, this is the interior. My mom said it looked like a church, and I was like, when was the last time you saw a minion in church? I'm also sure this most of this work breaks, almost every copyright law in the books in the United States. But yeah, we took a chunk of it and we CNC milled it out of solid marble, 2 foot by 2 foot block, which is now too heavy to remove from my office, which means they can never fire me. Um, but this weird kind of thing which popped up is using these objects in a way that it became cute, that it kind of became humorous, is something Andrew Kovacs brought up in this discussion we just had with some of the students. But it's a strain of work in the office which we pursued. And one of the first bodies of projects we started to work with that on was for Lady Gaga and her creative director, Nicola Formichetti. So Lady Gaga's online avatar is a mermaid, and Nicola Formichetti's is a panda. So we just started by like reproducing the historic greats like Michelangelo's Pietà with a panda and a mermaid, trying to get our handle around the form, but then eventually just ended up kit bashing it all together. And this proved too expensive to make even out of foam, so we ended up really dialing it back and just producing vacuum form panda panels. This is the store in Beijing. These are all backlit with LEDs in collaboration with Stage Technologies, which is the same company that did like Batman Returns and some interesting movies. So the whole space changes color and hue, and it's filled with merchandise and also a bunch of Lady Gaga's outfits because it was time to open with her concert in San Francisco. We did a sister project to that one in Beijing where we did chrome um, chromed panels with kind of robotic light cannons which shot all over the place. We did a one in New York which didn't end up with any pandas in it, but it was just like a large, giant, faceted cave, but also had a lot of Lady Gaga stuff and merchandise in it. You can see some of the things from her like telephone video, which ended up kind of like producing a series of collaborations between Nicola Formichetti and I, because I had working on his early stores when he was getting started. I just basically took a small percentage in the company, so now I'm like a part owner of a small fashion label. So I'm hugely wealthy. No, not at all. But we just have our first capsule collection with Amazon, and it's going on sale at Macy's. And we just did a line of cosmetics for MAC Cosmetics, so you can, Andrew, you can buy your new MAC Cosmetics this fall. Um, but this is the line from last season. It's kind of like um, I do all the accessory design, so these are some of the cute accessories that have been produced from backpacks and bendy rings and nose rings, shoes, different colored materials being slammed together, panda eyewear. Some of the things weren't made. This was a set of sunglasses, which was intended to make you look like a panda. Uh, and then our iPhone case, which was this, highly baroque collision of all of these little panda characters. This is this poor woman wearing all of the jewelry we produced, and Lady Gaga wearing head to toe Nico Panda with some of the sunglasses. And we also worked on an outfit for Lady Gaga with Nicola, where we scanned her face and a bunch of her fans' faces and 3D printed them and made this harness. And there's a video. It's called Viva Glam if you want to watch it, but it's not really germane to the. Yeah. what's funny is like I have to edit this out of the video version because the lawyers won't give me rights to show her work. It's like they saw me showing the work, and like bleeped it out or something. We've done a number of projects in the fashion industry, like small projects. We did a 40-foot by 80-foot tent for H&M at the Coachella Music Festival with a giant projection ceiling and these fiberglass pieces that had interactive walls. We collaborated with Oculus Rift on a kind of landscape. So we scanned their fabric for one of the dresses so you could actually walk at microscopic scale across the fabric. We did a store for Diesel in Williamsburg, which was these digital surfaces. We did a series of interactive installations for Intel and W Hotels in London, New York, San Francisco, Hong Kong, and Singapore. But those are, it's kind of like the trajectory of like technology projects in the office, which I'm finding increasingly less and less familiar because they're just so commonplace. But one of them I will show was our largest project to date that we worked on in Manhattan, which was for a couple of different organizations. But the Times Square Theater on 42nd and 8th has been empty since 1988. And there's a company called 1010 Media, which has just purchased the lease for, I believe, 100 years. And the program was to add two immersive theaters that show 30-minute movies. So tourists are kind of cycling through to look at like shortened versions of A Bug's Life and things like that. But this is the headquarters that owns the site, which is a new building, has a theater in it. And this building, which is literally on some of the most valuable real estate in Manhattan, has been empty for, 35 years. It's right across the street from Madame Tussauds. So the person that owns this land has this office which looks out over this giant gold hand, which is like 20 feet by 40 feet, which she just hates. So in order to get on our good side, our first proposal was like as a response. Um, but what we actually wanted to do was use the screen technology they're using all over Times Square, but not do a big flat facade. There's a problem with all of the Times Square facades, digital facades, is that when even one of the little screens develops a hiccup or a glitch, the whole image is ruined. So we were looking at a kind of pixelated cloud where you could have lower resolution screens up high, higher resolution screens down low, and you could replace them over time instead of doing them all at once. And if any screen went dark, it wouldn't ruin the whole image. Like if you're American Eagle and you show an image and there's some of the pixels out, you don't have to pay for that advertisement because it wasn't showing the whole image. But these things go out all the time. We were working with a company called ODA, which has built a lot of stuff in Manhattan. I'm not going to go through the details too much, but there's just two essentially like theaters almost exactly the same size as this, oriented sideways with a sky lobby that separates them. And I will show you where we're using this Renaissance technique of anamorphosis to make some of the content visible from particular key locations. This is from the subway entrance across the street. There's no music for this. But the sky lobby is the part in the middle where the elevator takes you up and you either go up the stairs or down the stairs into one of the theaters. And then to get by historic preservation, this is the historic New York Times building behind, and they wanted us not to block that view. So our proposal was to project that view on the front and have the world's first invisible building, which they actually like totally loved, which is, yeah, which is great. Great. No, no risk of being built at this point. The company that bought the lease basically like collapsed, um, and collapsed with a good chunk of my fee. uh, we've had some other close brushes with possible success. In Manhattan, this was for JDS Development, which is the company that's funding the shop tower on 57th Street, which some of you may be familiar with. This is adjacent on 22nd Street to a building by Norman Foster, and it's on top of what used to be the Dia Arts Foundation. And we had done some work for them on trying to develop a building that was more luxurious than the Foster building next to us. So how do you do that with a kind of stock curtain wall system? How do you use things like toned concrete in a series of panels that has a kind of more detailed, high resolution language, and this is what we came up with. This is it at night, a kind of typical, well, I mean, not typical Manhattan apartment, but floor through apartment for, let's say, high net worth individuals. The project since went to Annabelle Seldorf, who I'm sure will do something good. But for that same client, they were doing the shop building on 57th Street, which is this one right here. And we were just like so jealous that Shop did this project, and we really wanted to do one, even though we weren't really invited to. So we pretended this was a real project, and we dropped it in all the real estate blogs. And this was probably our first parafictional project, but like the real estate industry in Manhattan like erupted, mostly with complaints and hate mail, but a couple compliments. One of them said it looked like Michelangelo had come back to life and designed a skyscraper, which is the only one I sent to my mom. But a lot of them were like, "You're ruining architecture. You can't imagine the kind of vociferous anti-architecture comments we got." But it was intended took the exact same format as the Raphael Vignoli one and just ran it through this language of kit bashing to see what it would be produced when you combine a kind of standard glass curtain wall with some of these higher resolution areas. So, found videos during lectures are a great way to take a drink of water. This one should have sound. Is there sound? Sound person? No sound. Anyways, you get it. This one, what we were trying to do was like abstract the objects. You can come look. We're trying to abstract the objects so they weren't as recognizable as they were in the Helsinki one, with the exception of those propellers and the wings. But through basically taking these objects and elongating them, trying to retain some of their high resolution detail, but not make them so, let's say, symbolically recognizable. But this is like 40 stories up on a 102-story building, so I'll save you the pain of the rest. But I'll get to the wings. We had this really great music where it gets to the wings. It's the Massive Attack's Angel, and it sings about angels right when the wings come up. So imagine the brilliance in your mind. And then we collaborated with a conceptual artist, one of the guys here in Hollywood that's done a lot of work on movies, named Patrick Fowletter, just to sketch out some of the entrance and some of the lobby and public areas inside the building. We took a similar strategy on a much smaller project on Bond Street, and the idea just conceptually was to have this rustication, which started out very flat, and as it tumbled down, it got thicker and thicker and thicker, almost occupiable. Obviously, this wasn't like a real proposal. It was dialed back to be something much more restrained, but you can see that kind of, let's say, kit-bashed relief. Starts out, let's say, less detail at the bottom and increases to what's almost like a historic cornice of random kit-bashed objects on the penthouse unit. Another one for a hotel project called the Metropole in Tribeca, which was essentially, if you look on the right, like minus the white part, it's basically just a glass box with these pilasters of panels elevated above the fourth floor. So it looks almost like cloud-like with these puffy kit-bashed panels. It's just 4 panels repeated. We've been working with this high-resolution concrete company called Tactile, and they make this incredibly high-strength concrete, but one of the added bonuses is because it's so finely grained, it takes on incredible amounts of detail, but we haven't actually gotten to the point of building something. Another project, this one kind of working in reverse, kit bashing voids out of a house in rural Quebec. You can see the removal of these chunks of material, which revealed the thickness. The idea was to produce something that the material is travertine, so we wanted it to appear ruinous from the get-go, as it's in a very, it's called a taiga forest. It's a really robust botanical environment, but almost impossible to keep anything clean and pristine. So we started from the ruin and worked backwards into the architecture. And you can see the kind of scale of a person going up through this cowl entrance The idea was to have a kind of cavernous interior, mainly just for entertaining. Another project we used this language on was in Riyadh. This is from my hotel room. Zaha has a kind of really incredible building here and another one off by the airport. This was intended to be a seed kernel for the Riyadh Automotive Museum. There's a client has a collection that we wanted to form the foundation of this museum, and there was going to be a location for storage and fundraising in Ad Burea, which is to the north west of the city. This is actually the site. So I joked that like we did a lot of analysis of the building heights and traffic patterns, and um, what we came up with was what would basically be a starter point for the museum. We weren't in any way hired to do the museum, but a storage facility, and I think we maybe shot too far by making it vertical when it probably made more sense to put it all underground. But the idea was that you would pull up in your car, be elevated, park, go by the rest of the automotive collection into the fundraising area above. And the lower floor was a catering kitchen, basically. So here's the scale of the car. Here's it's basically a vertical car park like they have in most cities these days. This is as tall as you can go in one if it's supported by something other than itself. And that's the volume up top. And the last family of projects, it's getting away from the use of lots of objects and trying to work towards, I don't know, this is a fractal generation program, which in order to get into Rhino, we had to go through medical software and cut MRI slices of it to import it. And we ended up taking that process and just using it as a kind of formal language that has different resolutions of detail from different distances. So you get variations of what's the same language, but let's say significant variations of it depending on what scale you're looking at the building at. So the first one we tried this on was our National Center for Science and Innovation in Kaunas in Lithuania, which was a competition that 155 firms entered, and we received an honorable mention. I was told that we were fourth, and the top three each got 25,000 euros. Um, but you can see it's a collection of these cube-like fractal masses, and where the masses start to disintegrate, that's where you get apertures. So this is the main entrance. You can see someone there for scale, and you can see how the language kind of shifts at different resolutions. The center atrium is just an incredibly tall, more of a light well. But this is looking up 7 stories right after you walk in. And then the floors are oriented, some of them oriented in, and like this floor is oriented out towards the park view. So there's a kind of flip-flopping of windows and orientation. This project was for a subterranean museum in Lima, Peru, that a lot of architects entered. It's kind of a strange project because all you could really design was the entrance piece. So this was our entrance piece, this like kind of massive megalithic structure which you would just walk down into a courtyard. So here you see the section, walk through this giant thing, come down to the second story, and then you have a giant vaulted structure that you proceed down back into the exterior courtyard. So it's one main large floor plate area with smaller pixelated different shaped volumes off to the sides. And this is the entrances. The lower courtyard, you can see this is where you would enter from above. The center circulation piece that punctures the top. So it's daylit, but you would see people in the park above looking down into this cavernous, almost grotto-like space, which is something we started pursuing on another project. This was for a Harvey Milk plaza in San Francisco, a competition that we were invited to enter. And it's also a subway stop. And our idea was that subway stops are generally pretty filthy and disgusting. So again, we went to the grotto direction because grottos look good when they're dirty. and subway stations that are like modernist and sleek and glass, especially in New York, look terrible when they get dirty. So the ambition was to just essentially plant the hell out of it using this triangulated fractal pattern that you see here on the floor, and that forms what's almost like classical coffers at the top. So you kind of get a natural reading of the space at the same time you realize by virtue of its symmetry and some of the coffering languages that it's entirely artificial, hovering on that line between the two. And towards the back, we were looking at more literal classical coffering. So this is like my previous life coming back to haunt me, but using coffering as something which generates higher and higher orders of complexity. If you ask me how you're going to make it, I have no idea. Another project in Lithuania was for the Kirlianis Concert Hall. This project had 122 entries, and we received an honorable mention, and the top three received 25,000 euros. And it's literally like half a mile from the other one we almost placed in. But it's along the coast, the waterfront, and it's for a concert hall and some ancillary programs. We essentially just put a big public plaza with some connections down to the waterfront using a bunch of different like high resolution objects to define the space and house some of those different programmatic elements. So it took on kind of an infrastructural hit best quality, and looking at paintings by like Poussin and how you aesthetically interlock quote unquote nature with a composition like this is the view you would get from the parking lot. The concert hall itself was intended to be the opposite of Alice Tully Hall in New York by Dillon Scofidio, where you have a curtain wall that flips up so you see the inside and everything is revealed. This was intended to hide everything, that there's clear locations where you enter, but it wasn't intended to broadcast any of the interior because we wanted the interior to be kind of surprising and majestic. So we took the idea from Walt Disney Hall, your neighbor here, of the organ at the back, and we tried to drop it from the ceiling. So it would, I taught a concert hall studio with Frank at Yale, and the acoustician Yasu Toyoda was talking about the value of having detail in a ceiling because it breaks up the sound and scatters it. So the idea was essentially that, organ hanging from above. Jumping up in scale, we were just hired, not hired, asked, hired with assumed pay. We're asked by New York Magazine to speculate on the future of the city 50 years into the future. New York Magazine is having its 50th anniversary issue, and they asked our office and Diller and Scofidio and Norman Foster and some other firms, but I love being included in that group. Makes me sound more important than I am. But I got really freaked out about Hurricane Harvey, which was happening at the time we were designing this. And Hurricane Harvey lifted up and dropped a 15-foot swell of water on Houston. And that isn't just like regular global warming sea level rise. That's like the hurricane lifts up because it's a low pressure system, a dome of water, takes it inland and drops it. So I used New York City's flood calculator to determine how much of Manhattan and the surrounding boroughs would be flooded if Hurricane Harvey's storm surge landed on the city. And this is, I don't know why that's happening. I'm being rejected by Perloff Hall. This is Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and huge chunks of Manhattan just end up underwater. The big problem is the East River, because the areas bordering the East River are lower than those on the west side. But my apartment's like here, so I'm pretty much shot. The new proposal on the table is Bjarke Ingels' proposal to do a U that has a series of levees, and all the U really does is protect the Wall Street area. But if you look at the rest of Manhattan that still gets flooded, uh, me being a champion of the poor, wanted to do something about this and calculated that it would take 42 miles of new levee to stop the East River from flooding. So our solution was to just drain the East River and put a dam there, and put a dam there, and put a dam there, and use it all as parkland. So that's the view. And I don't know if we like overshot our mark, but Diller and Scofidio proposed roof gardens, and Norman Foster's office proposed expanding Madison Square Park and adding movable chairs and temporary furniture. I don't know if we like took the idea of visionary a little bit, a bit too far, um, but it got a good run in the press, including more hate mail, thinking this would never work. But the proposal that what we would design these giant geothermal wells. There's no subways and things, so you could actually use this for parkland infrastructural wells, but also vertical parks that take you from the city level down to this new, what we're calling the East River Valley. And upon doing research, I actually learned that the East River isn't actually a river. It's called a tidal estuary, and geologists call it a flooded valley. So we didn't do it, but we were gonna start a Kickstarter campaign to like rescue the East River Valley. You know? And these are some of those vertical parks which take you from Wall Street level down these series of ramps to this geothermal power, sustainable power. It's lead silver. Geothermal vents, um, and this is the large dam. This is the view from. Those are some of the vertical parks. See, I don't know how. Well, really didn't research too much about how geothermal wells work, but I think there's something cold that comes out. There's a view from underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. You can see wheat fields of my native Nebraska. And then the last two projects I'm going to show here are very tiny, both guest residences. One is in Shropshire, England, and I got a phone call to do this project, and um, this is like this super interesting client who told me his family collects pre-Raphaelite art, and he has this estate that was built in 1532, about 2 hours northwest of London. It's basically a vacation estate, and he said he was going to buy a Rossetti, a pre-Raphaelite painting, but he decided that if he did that, he would only be a caretaker of culture and not producing culture. And he wanted to maybe invest in culture, and he didn't know what painter to do. So he wanted to invest in architecture and build a small library, a private library for some of his collection on this property. And I asked him how he got our name, you know, and he said, well, he spent like a month and did a bunch of research online and whittled it down to his 5 favorite architects. And I was like, how did you choose us? And he goes, well, of the 5, you were the only one that wasn't dead. But Frank Lloyd Wright was on the list, so I think we're in good company. And just by pure coincidence, my family, uh, my family owned large estates in this area. My 14th great grandfather was Sir John Gage, who was the vice chancellor to Henry VIII, and we owned property that was adjacent to this property at the same time this was built. So it's entirely possible that my 14th great grandfather had visited this original home, which is called Penkridge Hall. And then our addition was intended to be is intended to be this small public library. Because it's on this historic site, we have to go through an organization called Historic England, which has the right to reject any design ideas. So we're trying to play on some of the, I guess, memory of the diagonality of the Tudor, some of the local materials to do a stone, let's say at higher resolution, but not funny in that kind of kit bashing funny way, but kit bashing for a kind of reintroduction of a level of detail, which you would find on projects in the area like Lutyens Home. It's really a simple program. It's essentially a living room, large book area, and then a sleeping loft above, because it would double as his private hangout library and guest residence when needed. And this is the view of the stair. Another one of these, which a different client saw that, and this one is in Gais in France, which is a less glamorous site with only one view corridor, but it uses that similar language that we had used on Lithuania at a smaller scale. So it's essentially just intended to have a giant picture window looking out towards the only view that there is. But it also looks like an object in a landscape, so there's a kind of still life quality to it wanting to look this particular way. And then you can see you just enter on the kitchen level and up to the living room. There's a sleeping area in the back and a single bathroom. So it's about as small as you can get and still have a guest house. The installation that we did at SciArc, which is actually coming down tomorrow, so you won't be able to see it, took some of the genetics of these languages we were using and built them at large scale to do this parafictional, scientific, sustainable geothermal futures lab, which doesn't really make sense if you talk about it. I just gave a lecture at Kent State last week and tried to present it and just like totally fell flat. Like when a comedian tells a bad joke. If you want to learn more about the project, you go to magneticfutures.com. But I think maybe it's telling that we finally found a way to develop an architectural project that's lecture resistant. But the project has um, like historic architectural references, components from science, sustainability. This is me actually like working the lab, and there's a series of videos that's on the SIRC website. But it uses these little Damien Hirst reveals of the nature of the fictionality in the machine, and does a series of these highly artificial but super technical drawings, which also have these little reveals in them, like this cross section of the machine is spitting out a hamburger at the bottom. I told you it makes no sense until you go to the website. Just need to make sure sound works, so this won't make any sense. But I just gave a version of this same talk at the Chicago Biennial, and was really like taken to task by this one architect who was talking about how uh, unnecessary it is for architecture to have a theoretical framework. And this discussion that I'm trying to have and trying to write about architecture maybe having the possibility of dealing with hierarchy and reality and perfection in new ways, um, really got shot down in a pretty harsh way by this guy. And he was making the argument that his work, which is a lot more built work, it's very beautiful, but you don't need the conceptual underpinnings for architecture because all you have to do is understand the materials. That concrete behaves in a certain way, and timber behaves in a certain way, and glass behaves in a certain way. And my argument back to him was that that's not working outside a conceptual framework. That's just working in a conceptual framework that's 250 years old, developed by Carl Linnaeus, probably the father of the Enlightenment, who was the first guy to separate natural objects into categories so you could focus on their inherent properties in the same way this guy was focusing on concrete, wood, timber, and a category specific way of looking at the world. Carl Linnaeus was looking at amphibians and fish and insects through that very language of categorization. So it wasn't that this guy wasn't working with a conceptual framework, it was just that he was working with one that was almost 300 years old and completely oblivious to it, which made me realize that if you're asking people to look at their own realities, that it would require architects to question our own frameworks for how we design. And one thing I'm working with my students now is kind of analyzing their previous projects and the frameworks that we've used to design those. Are they using analysis and a kind of Bjarke Ingels, neoliberal capitalism, rocks, fast forward techniques, or what are the languages and what are the processes they're using actually saying about their work that they're not even aware of? That it is at least causing me at the very minimum to reconsider the apparatus, the conceptual apparatus that my work is emerging from, which I started the lecture with Meryl Streep. I want to end with Meryl Streep, but I need to make sure we have sound. Magic sound person. Oh, coming out of my laptop. Can you hear that? What do you think, guys? No sound? So good. Still no sound. Can I recite it verbatim? Actually, maybe I can just put the microphone by my speaker. Will that work?
Saloon, and I'm on board. But do you think it's too much like from July? I thought that, but no, not with the right accessories. It should work. Where are the belts? Here and then.
All right. The perfect segue I had before that technical hiccup was keeping the idea of a conceptual framework existing that you're oblivious to.
And I think it can be very interesting. No. No, it's just baffling to me. Why is it so impossible to put together a decent run through? You people have had hours and hours to prepare. It's just so confusing to me. Where are the advertisers? We have some pieces from Banana Republic. Well, we need more, don't we? Oh, this is emergency. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, you know me. Give me a full ballerina skirt and a hint of saloon, and I'm on board.
But do you think it's too much like
Delacroix from July? I thought that, but no, not with the right accessories. It should work.
Where are the belts for this strap? Why is no one ready? Here. It's a tough call. They're so different. Something funny? Oh. No, nothing's, it's just that both those belts look exactly the same to me. I'm still learning about this stuff and, This stuff? Oh, okay. I see. You think this has nothing to do with you. You go to your closet and you select, I don't know, that lumpy blue sweater, for instance, because you're trying to tell the world that you take yourself too seriously to care about what you put on your back. But what you don't know is that that sweater is not just blue. It's not turquoise. It's not lapis. It's actually cerulean. You're also blithely unaware of the fact that in 2002, Oscar de la Renta did a collection of cerulean gowns, and then I think it was Yves Saint Laurent, wasn't it, who showed cerulean military jackets. I think we need a jacket here. And then cerulean quickly showed up in the collections of 8 different designers. And then it filtered down through the department stores and then trickled on down into some tragic casual corner where you no doubt fished it out of some clearance bin. However, that blue represents millions of dollars and countless jobs. And it's sort of comical how you think that you've made a choice that exempts you from the fashion industry when in fact you're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
Thank you. Now I could accept questions and compliments. Start with compliments.
Hi, Mark. I love the lecture. I think the work looks great. I guess my question might be in the kind of preamble that opened with a sort of appeal to truth, and then moving through the work and sort of ending with Meryl Streep's, the kind of demonstration of expertise. I saw the sort of truth problem, in Entasis. I mean, it was a kind of a parafiction about correcting realities and how you perceive those realities. But the word that didn't maybe pop up and something I'm curious to hear you speak about is it seems like a trust problem, that there's a kind of, that the architect is perhaps speculating certain fictions that one might trust that could lead to a better future, that there are sort of types of expertise that can operate in certain ways. And so perhaps I'm a little more skeptical on the kind of open introduction to truth. And I see maybe in the kind of concluding that there's a kind of and through the kind of virtuosity, technical virtuosity of the work. I'm just wondering if you can speak maybe about like the role of the architect and sort of certain trusted figures.
Yeah. I've introduced skepticism to you. That's the goal. The point of parafictional work isn't to convince you that something is the truth. It's to invite you to take a closer look at the truth that you take for granted. It's different than the critical project, which is intended to raise awareness of a particular problem. Instead, it's it's almost like an invitation to curiosity, is what it's called it sometimes. So there's no truth that any of the parafictional work is trying to get you to see. There's only the ambition that it gets you to look more deeply at what you take for granted. So let's take the cerulean sweater example. Uh, I don't know, maybe there's 100, 200 people in this room. Maybe one of you is wearing cerulean and you thought differently about what you're wearing, or it made you think a little bit about color. Like, that's the action, not whether or not the narrative that she gave was true. And I actually did research into cerulean. The dialogue she gave is true, but that's not where cerulean was popularized. It was actually introduced as color of the year by Pantone 4 years before it showed up in those collections. So that truth is irrelevant. What's more relevant is enticing you to look more closely at your own. And that's what Hal Foster, surprisingly, Hal Foster, like the most critically engaged art critic of the last several decades, is writing about Damien Hirst's work and parafictionality as being able to combat fake news in some way, in that it may invite people to look with closer scrutiny and skepticism at the things which are presented to them. So the fact that I made that argument and you're skeptical of it means I win.
Hi, Mark. Long time listener, first time caller. Been listening since log 17. 15, actually, when you were talking about the Baroque. So I kept thinking about your response to Michael Meredith's essay. And in some ways, I also keep thinking about maybe the word indifference. And in some ways, I keep thinking, with the way you talk about the kit bashing project, with the removal of the meaning of the objects that are being attached onto a contemporary bas relief, rendering, Hercules as meaningless as Jesus, as anything else, as grapevines or
Not
grapes.
rendering it meaningless as much as like introducing the possibility for any number of possible readings by any possible number of people, depending on their inquisitiveness and scrutiny.
But I guess the one common denominator I've been thinking about this a lot and really wanting to have a conversation with you about it, which is between the two of you, I am observing a kind of operational stoicism where you make yourself morphable in both cases. Mm-hmm. I mean, this might be a longer conversation, but I'm wondering,
well, one has to be shrewd in academia not to entirely hitch your cart to a sick horse, But I also don't think there's one inherent truth in architecture, that there's one agenda necessarily, and certainly not now. I don't know. I mean, it's really difficult to talk about this material because it's not tied to a particular technology or aesthetic, which I think is easier to talk about work when it has a direct formal outcome. But I tell my students that it took, and I just said this in the previous class, that it took 250 years to get from Brunelleschi to Borromini, which is a really long architectural project, and certainly some of the aesthetic ambitions enabled by that appear in these projects were only possible via the appearance of digital technology and fabrication in architecture. So I think these might actually be, related and part of some larger thing that's happening in architecture over a long time. But I'm entirely convinced that whatever it is and whatever it becomes, or if anything, if it doesn't just end up in the dustbin, that whatever I'm doing right now will probably look and sound pretty ridiculous and naive, in the same way that Brunelleschi's work is ridiculous and naive in the term classicism. That isn't to say that I'm Brunelleschi. More to say that I appreciate it, like in architecture, where there's things on the table, that there's things that there's not answers to, that faculty don't come in and, have the answers to the questions, but there's actually enough on the table that keeps students, like that students can make a contribution to the discourse of architecture now in as a legitimate way as faculty. that isn't always the case when faculty have had the benefit of 20 years of a discourse or 10 years of a discourse in which they have expertise in. I would say there is no expertise in this discourse. There may be expertise in some ability for people to develop a parafictional like reveal in art or in Black Mirror or in The Handmaid's Tale. I don't know how it happens in architecture yet, but I know that there's no expert on parafictional discourse. Just because the term itself is like 3 years old. I mean, it's like Carrie Lambert Betty at Harvard, as far as I know, was the first person to write about it in the arts. But I don't know. Maybe it goes nowhere, but it just occurs to me that like big problems with reality over here. Some creative disciplines have some tools with which to start to address reality. Architecture has a history of dealing with reality. Like maybe there's some connection there, or maybe there's just not, and we should go, make some money, and I should just design more products and get royalties. I don't know, but I think the lecture format is more interesting to present something that's not figured out, because I could just very easily present something I've already written about, and I'd have much better answers. But I don't know where this is going. It's just what keeps me interested in designing right now, and kind of gets me out of bed, and it's what I talk about with my friends. And architecture as a profession is rewarding for those reasons more than it's rewarding for the financial reasons, as I'm sure many of you know. But it's rewarding, and I'm able to do this collaborative project between Yale and SciArc, kind of based on some of these ideas, and talk to my friends there and talk to my friends here. And it's nice to have something that's expanding outside of architecture into TV and the arts, and just kind of like try to make those connections and email those people and see what the hell they're thinking.
Hi.
Curious, I'm one of those material guys banging 300-year-old materials and how to use them type of deal. But
with no prejudice.
with this design, have you come across any other interesting materials? You talked about that fine-grained concrete that can be milled like stones, or anything else that you've come across or started to maybe influence the development of to kind of make some of this stuff come to life?
Well, not in a really convincing way. There's certainly materials one could explore, but basically milling foam and casting things, milling foam, and we're still in the milling kind of trajectory for a lot of this stuff. But some of these materials are pretty interesting, but I don't have any expertise with them because I haven't really had the cause to really dig in. I would love to dig in and have a client that's like really interested in realizing this and finding out what can be done. The closest thing we're getting is that Penkridge Hall library, where I think we are going to be able to use some of those tactile panels, but that also has actually a very low resolution. There's not a lot of fine grained carving and stuff. It's basically a bunch of, Paul Rudolph used those same strategies by having slats of wood and casting the concrete to take the wood pattern from the slats of wood. We're just offsetting the slats basically, and it's probably not actual wood.
Thanks, Mark. And I really enjoyed it for the second time. It was great. And but just going back for a minute to what you were just saying. In terms of you don't know where this is going to, and then like whose role is to define where this is going to? This is being presented in a specific format, like within an academic environment. Then it's presented also, in a specific format to, some clients, and like, what do you think? Like, what's the future of this in terms of, like a process from which this is tested or evaluated? Is it part of just like purely discourse, or when it becomes material and then the client actually decides to?
My secret ambition, is of course it becomes material. Like I get something freestanding out of the ground and built that has some of the ambitions I'm interested in. And I think that's like the ambition of most architects is that, it's very easy to build things. It's very difficult to build things that have any architectural ambition that you're interested in whatsoever at the end of the process. And I, hope I was just talking about this lecture that Frank gave at Yale, Frank Gehry, and he showed only work from the first 5 years of his office. And he was like, this is a kitchen I did for my sister. I used black tile. Like, this is a roof I replaced. And it's just amazing, like, all the things he went through building up ideas to a kind of real project. And it's just like, I don't know, man. I'm in my 40s, and from what I see, most architects don't start getting real good commissions until their mid 60s. So I feel I got like 25 years to play around. No, I desperately want to get something built. Like, I'm not gonna lie. Most of the stuff I built is like interiors and fashion, temporary pop-up things, and those have a place, and those have absolutely had a place in my trajectory. But I would, you know, as much as I love the freedom that those temporary pop-up things enable you, I would love to build something like real and solid that would last and that has some permanence and that isn't like I've actually built things and they've turned out nothing like I wanted them because they were value engineered to death, which is probably my fault for not really understanding the materials and what could be done early enough, so that by the time they got beaten down and value engineered, I wasn't like properly armed with the right material intelligence. But we're starting to make some headway on that very small project in England, and that's pretty interesting to me. So fingers crossed.
I'm curious about what I see as a coherence of something, maybe method, but then what I was a little concerned about in the found object and the reflection, the distortion on reality. I mean, if parafictional practices are new, I'll take that. I think the technique is very much kind of Pynchon and Mark Lehner and David Foster Wallace and postmodernism in the best way you could be postmodern. Mm-hmm. But it feels like that's something. But in the work, I see somebody you didn't mention at all, which is Sullivan, who was neither historicist nor totally modern, mm-hmm. but super interesting in the whole seed germ, mm-hmm. Kind of layering, relief. I mean, I see a lot of that moment between periods that mm-hmm. Sullivan was so interesting about. And I'm just wondering if you're looking at that stuff and thinking about that stuff.
It's ironic is like when I was an undergraduate, I was like obsessed with Sullivan. Like Frank Lloyd Wright is he worked for Sullivan, and Frank Lloyd Wright said Sullivan was the only architect whose work he actually respected. And I love those transitional moments, and I think you do too. Like when most of the when new material comes in the profession and people don't really know what to do with it, there's always these like transitional knuckles before you develop that expertise. And I would say, yeah, you're totally right on that postmodern aspect of the objects. I was invited to do this symposium with Jimenez and Andrew at Princeton called Delight. And I was like, why the fuck am I getting invited to the symposium on delight with these guys? I'm not delightful. I'm not going for anything delightful. I'm no one doing anything fun. But yeah, there's definitely that like postmodernist, like fun kind of echo. The thing about Sullivan though is he died penniless and homeless.
Oh. But I just think that that say Pynchon and Lehner and those people in literature, and maybe the two people you were at the conference with, there's a reliance on precedent and history that's necessary to drive the collision of things. Yeah. And I'm just wondering if you're going to overload it with so much stuff, whether those collisions are necessary, or in some of the projects where you just jettison that and just make a language like Sullivan did. Yeah. What's the difference? And frankly, I think the difference is really critical in terms of style and coherence. I think it's probably not in terms of process and space and affect.
No, I think you're right. It's weird because I'm doing a book and having discussions with the editor at Rizzoli on what to put on the cover, and he really wants to put the Khaleesi thing with the wings on the cover, And I'm like, no, it's so embarrassing. Like, I did that project and it was at a moment in time, but I don't want that to be like the herald for all of my work. And he's like, but that's the project that everybody relates to the most. It's the most picturesque. So I'm like, I don't really want to like be tied to that, you know? So I'm having this like you're watching an existential crisis coincident with a midlife crisis. Uh, but yeah, I think you're totally right. There's those different trajectories, and I don't really know where it's going, but I think you're totally right in identifying them. But I hadn't thought of the Sullivan moment. I've been thinking a lot about Brunelleschi, but Sullivan's actually probably more interesting and similar for that reason. He literally died homeless.